bill myself as an author, attorney, and consultant, but I'm also a college professor. I teach business law in the MBA program at Oklahoma State University, and I teach a variety of courses from time to time at the University of Oklahoma, including uh, cultural diversity and nonprofit leadership and management. I've written a lot about the African American experience, particularly as it relates to the history of the state of Oklahoma, which has great relevance to American history more generally. I have a consulting practice that I do mostly uh, diversity and inclusion related work and work that relates to governance of nonprofit organizations.
Can you tell us about your work specifically as it's connected to reparations?
My One of the topics of my writing has been the 1921 Tulsa race riot, which is the worst of the so-called race riots in American history, that obliterated the Black Wall Street, a really successful Black entrepreneurial community here in Tulsa that was known nationwide. And part of that discussion involves how that event was treated after it happened, both by the city leadership and the community itself. The community was actually rebuilt substantially, and within 20 years was booming, really at a higher level of sophistication than it ever had been. So the question arises as to what the city's obligation and the state's obligation was and is to the people who were essentially burned out and brutalized in 1921. And in 2003, a lawsuit was filed, a federal lawsuit seeking cash reparations for living riot survivors and cash reparations for heirs of survivors who had lost property. That lawsuit was deemed to be time barred and was fully and finally dismissed in 2005. But the question remains, what sorts of reparations are appropriate? And when I use the word reparations, I use it in a broad sense, meaning to make amends or to repair. So cash outlays are a possible form of reparation, but certainly not the only form.
Can you describe some of the other approaches to reparations that were laid out in a commission, or at least in a conversation prior to us recording? And what was the context of that?
It was a state-created commission to study the 1921 Tulsa race riot. It was created in 1997 by Governor Keating and the legislature. It was an 11-member commission, 6 African Americans, 5 whites. They were charged with finding facts with regard to the riot and making recommendations. Among the recommendations were 5 types of possible reparations, including cash payments to living survivors, cash payments to survivors who had lost property, the establishment of a scholarship fund in commemoration of the riot, economic redevelopment initiatives, and finally, a substantial monument or memorial. And that final report issued in February of 2001. My particular take on those recommendations is that they failed to include one critical element, which is curriculum reform. One of the things that happened after the riot was that the whole story of Black Wall Street and the riot itself were really excised from history textbooks. It just wasn't included, and decades went by before people began to rediscover their own history. And even to this day, these aspects of Tulsa history are not properly included in the regular curricular materials in Oklahoma history and in other disciplines where it would be appropriate to include.
What would you say? Can you talk a little bit more about this missing piece of reparations? And and then after that, I think I want to move to a broader kind of notion of reparations. So maybe that can inform the next piece of the conversation.
I sit on the Race Rights Centennial Commission. The 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot comes up in 2020. And one of our projects is curriculum reform. So we've been working with the education department at the state level, the local school board and school district to create curriculum guides and lesson plans so that teachers have really a turnkey opportunity to share this history. And we've been working to get this adopted by the state and to create a teachers institute that would really bring teachers from throughout the state, immerse them in this history in an experiential way, and get them charged up and excited about teaching it and teaching other teachers how to teach this rich history. So that part of reparations is sort of underway currently. The other thing that's underway currently is that the state did appropriate some money for the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation and John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park. The park is a beautiful park with sculptures by renowned African-American sculptor Ed Dwight out of Denver. And it is that memorial or monument that helps commemorate these events with storyboards and again, sculptures and that sort of thing. That's a form of reparation, a form of making repair by engaging with the community and providing a showcase such that community members can come, can reflect, can learn about this history, and can ponder what it means for the present and the future.
I'm curious because, well, what are some of the obstacles to this kind of public education and even K through 12 kind of education? And also, I mean, would you say that, like, when talking about reparations, you know, people often might balk at public education because, I mean, is it possible that if the public education kind of moves, you know, for acknowledgement, that materially things stay the same?
I think that part of the historical resistance to including this in the curriculum includes kind of responses that we're all familiar with. One would be I think, encapsulated in the cliche, let sleeping dogs lie. Like, why stir this up? It's all in the past. Let's just move on. A couple of other psychological dynamics are at play, not just here, but I think always when we talk about reparation from some horrific historical wound, and that is shame, fear, post-traumatic stress disorder. All those psychological dynamics are operative, and they provide some level of conscious or subconscious resistance to the notion of reparations, and specifically reparations in terms of putting this permanently in the curriculum. So those are things that we have to confront. But I've found that in talking about this history all over the country, and certainly a lot here in town, with teenagers and younger folk, they feel that they've been cheated when they didn't learn this critical part of their own history. And so they are great ambassadors for this notion of curriculum reform, to telling the truth and telling the whole truth. So I think it will be done in time. I think the older generations are much more resistant to acknowledging these painful parts of our history than younger people are.
Nationally, what do you think is happening with reparations, and what do you think are some of the next steps? And particularly, you know, the Equal Justice Initiative Lynching Museum is opening in the next few weeks. What are your thoughts around those possibilities? What things are possible?
I'm an optimist, so I'd say all things are possible. But I also realize that we have to celebrate these really small victories, and we have to celebrate incremental change, because it's unlikely that we're going to get the whole change that we'd like to see in the world. I'm excited about the museum that's opening soon to commemorate our horrific history around lynching. I believe it's in Birmingham. Is that right?
It is.
So it reminds me that about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, a guy named James Allen, whom I met, did a remarkable book of lynching photography in America. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think the book is a book that everyone should have. It should be in every library. It is ghastly. It is horrific, but it also is part of our history. So part of our history is that we had people being brutalized, shot, burned, hanged, castrated, dismembered in the presence of lots and lots of other people, including young children, for many decades of our history. Now that sort of trauma, I think, transfers intergenerationally. Mm-hmm. And it's those kinds of wounds that we have to heal. And we can't heal them if we don't acknowledge that they're actually present and that they're profound and that they affect all of us. So that museum is yet another step in that acknowledgement process.
You know what I find interesting is that, like, for instance, in Yugoslavia, they have a museum of horrors that chronicles, informants and fascist regimes and the impact on the crowd, and then they just elected a right-wing proto-fascist government, or re-elected one. I mean, and then today we watch videos of people lynched by police shootings, and there's virtually dead silence in the larger white community, or at least in the power establishment. And it was similarly quiet in the Obama administration, from my own assessment. I mean, how do we get to acknowledgement when our murders have just kind of, they're not really shocking anymore to people, or that killing us is actually acceptable? Have we gotten there yet?
It's a tough nut to crack. I mean, we can't wait till everybody is on board. That's sort of not going to happen. And I do agree that we have become somewhat desensitized to violence of all kinds. And, but there have to be those voices out there, crying in the wilderness to make sure that people have an opportunity really to stop, look, and listen, to notice this, and to think about what it means in a larger sense.
Max, do you want to ask any questions? I muted you because there was some sound coming from your
thank you.
Your side, but if you tried to talk. And then after this, I was going to move on to grassroots reparations. But go ahead, Max.
I had a technical question about the lawsuit. Before Professor Ogletree announced that he had developed Alzheimer's, he wrote some articles in various Harvard law journals, and one of them was about all of his strategies for the reparations litigation. And one of them, anticipating, I don't remember when it came out, it might have been right around before the final decision from the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, but one of them anticipated, all of the problems with the statute of limitations, but he also was writing that he thought that there might be a way to avoid a statute of limitations problem with respect to property damage. He thought there might be ways in which property damage could survive that sort of a challenge. And I was wondering if you knew whether that was part of the litigation or whether that's still a kind of a challenge that's never been brought.
I don't know. That's interesting. I have to go back and check some stuff to figure that out. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly an interesting point. I don't know if that was covered specifically by the decision mm-hmm. that was later, federal court decision that was affirmed by the 10th Circuit and not heard by the Supreme Court. I don't know if the specific property claims are part of that or not.
Okay.
But it's interesting.
What was your thinking around the property damage? Does that sound like an effective approach, and why would that particular argument potentially get around a statute of limitations ruling?
If you're asking me, in the article, the Harvard Law Journal article, I didn't read that part super closely, but Ogletree was arguing that there are certain kinds of property damage and title defects and so forth that just are not subject to statute of limitations. So, taking Tulsa as an example, if property was illegally seized and ended up being owned by other people who didn't have a rightful claim to it, then or illegally seized by the city, that there might be ways to challenge that that would not be subject to statute of limitations because they might be defects in the chain of title, that sort of thing. I don't know the specifics, but he was hopeful that that might be a way to bring relief to descendants who suffered damage, who would have been entitled or would have inherited that property.
Right. I immediately what comes to my mind is the complexity and the time intensity of finding evidence of that. I just think that would be an incredibly difficult feat. That unless we had lawyers who were doing the work pro bono, mm-hmm. I'm not sure that the folks who would have such claims would be able to afford to prosecute them.
No, it would have to be a pro bono effort, of course.
So I wonder, what does this say, or does it speak at all to legal recourse, or not necessarily legislative, but lawsuits that are pushing for reparations? Go ahead.
I think pushing for judicially mandated reparations is a really tough row to hoe, and is not likely to be fruitful. And it might sound strange, but I think in some ways legislative reparations are much more palatable and much more achievable, because we know, for example, that even with respect to a similar incident in Florida, the Rosewood massacre in Florida, the Florida legislature actually came through with reparations, the monetary reparations for that 1923 event. It didn't go through the court system, went through the legislature.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I haven't looked at my records in a while, but again, the Florida legislature provided reparations for individuals who were harmed, either lost property and or were killed or otherwise physically harmed in the Rosewood massacre in 1923. So that's an example of an American state legislature authorizing reparations. We know that at the federal level, Congress provided reparations for people of Japanese ancestry who were interned during World War II. So that's another example of legislative reparations at the federal level.
You know, when I was looking at a list of books and subjects you had written on and talked on, and there was a piece in there around Native Americans and Black folk reparations. What were your thoughts about that? And I don't want to go too far off, but what are your thinking around that?
On Native American?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you know, here's just a little something like some of the tribes that I've been in contact, the Wabanaki tribe, some of the conversations around reparations have been, well, we look at it differently. We don't necessarily want cash, but it's more about land and more about rights and a great amount of tradition and Native American thinking is connected to that. So it may not.
It's a little bit.
Right.
It's not. It's almost apples and oranges because the federal government deals with Native American tribes as quasi sovereign. I mean, so Native American tribes are political entities that have limited aspects of sovereignty. So it's almost akin to nation relationships, whereas that's not the case with respect to African American people. We're not a political entity that has our own quasi sovereignty. So it makes things a little bit difficult to compare. So United States engaged for many years, as you know, with Native American tribes through the treaty making process. And a lot of those treaties are still in full force and effect. And so the notion of reparations, I think, is a little bit different and much more complex given that relationship.
That's kind of what I was thinking about. And I asked because we had a webinar and some of the people who were on the webinar asked that question. And so I have one final question, and Max may have others, but my question was about, given, legislative remedies are not legislative, but judicially mandated remedies encounter huge problems. What do you think is the future of reparations? And I know we had talked earlier about, grassroots reparations, and then you had mentioned also some groups doing symbolic reparations. What do you think is the future? I mean, given that there was a article and a report around the UN and the decade for people of African descent, and the UN panel urging or saying that Black folks in the U.S. should get reparations because of slavery and that history of trauma. I mean, I saw that shared. It continues to be shared. Like, at least a new person shares it on my social media feed each week. So, I mean,
right.
I think it's there. It's in people's consciousness, even though it's like a 3-year-old article.
Right. And I totally get that. But my caution is that the converse of that is there too. So it's my view that part of the reason we have the current federal administration that we have is because of the prior federal administration. So we have frankly, there's been a backlash against this notion that we had a had a black president. And that to me has unleashed this real swell of folk who feel emboldened to work against the tide of diversity and inclusion, and to work for the tide of the what they perceive to be the nostalgic status quo, white supremacy, white male power and dominance, and all that. That cuts against the notion of revisiting our tortured history, making reparations, and all that. So while you have the excitement on the one hand by some people about these issues, I think there probably is a roughly equal number of people, given our political situation in the United States, who are much less inclined to be engaged around a discussion of reparations. So for me, the more likely avenues to pursue for reparations include things that interweave people, that bring people together. Like, I'll use John Up Franklin Reconciliation Park here in Tulsa as an example. That sort of effort that's designed to bring people together in a reflective space, to provoke conversation, those sorts of things, are much more likely to be achieved in the current climate than judicially mandated reparations, legislatively mandated reparations, any of the stuff that seems to flow to individuals rather than build community.
What about, I mean, so that makes sense. That I can see that. But what I can also see is a number of small initiatives happening around the country. And, you know, the ones that I'm thinking about are Soul Fire Farm, which is in upstate New York, where a private donor gave a farm as personal reparations, and that farm is co-owned by a group of Black women, and they use it to educate Black youth about the natural environment. And then there's also the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, headed by Ed Whitfield, who's a former Black Panther, but he was also part of the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that amount is really about supporting, like, it gives loans, but it's almost like venture capital where folks, you know, they're really concerned with helping Black communities in the South survive.
Yeah, so I think there are two things to think about that are really different, and the prospects are different for these two things. One is things like you're talking about, which are private and or philanthropic efforts to build community, make reparation, look at our history. That's certainly doable, and there are people who have both the passion and the resources to do things that are productive and are helpful in healing our history. On the other hand, there are the more divisive kinds of things that we could pursue. Not that we shouldn't pursue them, but I'm saying, given our political situation, they are divisive because they involve asking the government to make reparations, right? As opposed to seeking private individuals and philanthropies to do this work. Two different tracks. One is more cumbersome because it gets us right into the thick of the political and cultural wars that we're having currently.
Could a massive private effort encourage other people who are on the fence? You know, given, like, you know, when we look at the way the legacy of slavery works today, we can see things from police violence to the way bank loans are divvied out to this day, is being connected to the legacy of slavery. Could these individual and grassroots efforts build into something even greater and impact public discourse about, particularly like when, there's a more conservative administration, there's less interest in supporting people at the bottom. And our communities are often at the bottom. Given that political reality, could grassroots efforts kind of shape into something else or inspire something else? And Max, do you have any more questions along with this?
I have one, but let's hear from Hannibal on this one.
So I think if we keep our eyes on the prize and we're focused on the long term, then the things that you just mentioned could have incredible impact, because to the extent that we engage children and youth and we expose them to these greater systemic dynamics that are important, I think going forward we can make positive change. But all this stuff, of course, it takes time, but certainly is worth pursuing. One example that comes to mind for me is when we talk about political polarization and all that, is the recent events surrounding the shooting in Parkland, Florida, and the emergence of these incredibly well-spoken, poised, thoughtful, and strategic teenagers. And one of the things that they've been saying is the issue of gun regulation and Second Amendment issues and how they come together. This is not a partisan issue. It doesn't need to be a partisan issue. So they illustrate the capacity of younger people to think outside this sort of partisan box that we seem unnecessarily locked into. The same is true about dealing with our history. I think it's possible to see reparations and healing our history as something that really doesn't need to be a partisan discussion at all. It's about what's better for all of us, all of our communities, our country as a whole. And acknowledging our history, it can't be changed. Acknowledging it is critical if we're ever to move forward together and leverage the capacity of each of us. It only benefits the whole.
Let me unmute Max. Go ahead, Max.
I wanted to go back to the to the report of the Oklahoma Commission, because I remember that the legislature did enact some of the recommendations, but not all of the 5.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you which ones were enacted and what you thought the holdup was on the ones that were not enacted.
Well, the holdup the backdrop in terms of the limitations on all the recommendations is money. Money always looms in the background.
Mm-hmm.
The legislature did not provide cash reparations to survivors. The legislature did not provide cash reparations to heirs of survivors who'd lost property. The legislature did set up a scholarship fund that was tied in a commemoration way to the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot and awarded, I think it was $1,000 scholarships to a couple of people from each of the 9 public high schools in Tulsa and a couple of other schools. They did do that. Mm-hmm. That went on for years. I'm not sure if it's ongoing. The legislature did set up an economic redevelopment commission focused on Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. The legislature, however, did not fund that commission, so the commission really did nothing. So they didn't have any wherewithal financially. And then the legislature did appropriate some monies to help create John F. Franklin Reconciliation Park. I think it was $3.5 million. The city donated the land, so there were some private funds raised as well. So the park, was dedicated in I believe it was 2010. And it's a beautiful park. It's a reflective space. It's got storyboards. It's got sculptures by Ed DeWhite. So those are some of the things that were done as a direct outgrowth of that report of the Oklahoma Commission to study the 1921 Tulsa race riot.
Thank you. Those are all of my questions, and I just deeply appreciate your time.